the moment my phone vibrated at the far end of the funeral hall, 40 years of my family's history began to crumble. It was just a single text, a short burst of numbers and a few Korean characters. But as I stared at the screen, I felt the cold grip of panic around my heart. In that instant, I understood something I had never truly realized. Sometimes, one text message is more terrifying than any will, more destructive than any spoken word. By the time my hands finished trembling, I could already sense I was burning the bridges behind me, turning from a daughter-in-law into an outsider with nothing left to say. I am a woman in my early 60s. My life has never stretched far beyond this neighborhood. I spent almost all of it behind the counter at a little bank branch, counting thousands of receipts, dealing with ledgers, and quietly watching elderly customers withdraw their pensions. My husband, Ki-seok, worked as a fixer for local plumbing and maintenance jobs, while my father-in-law, Jong-ho, ran his modest hardware store until his health took a sudden turn for the worse. My mother-in-law, Jong-hee, was always a sharp-edged force of nature, the person who poured all her care and attention into her eldest son, Young-soo. My husband and I, and by extension our own son Min-soo, simply learned to live quietly, careful not to ask for more than our share, an arrangement that left me fending for myself and the family, treading as softly as possible to avoid conflict. I had never known lasting peace, not even in my own family growing up. My marriage to Ki-seok, made when we were young and full of hope, was shadowed by years of tension between my parents and my in-laws, endless arguments that stained the beginning of my married life. Maybe that's why, as a daughter-in-law, I perfected the art of keeping the peace, patching over cracks with memory and patience, letting silence settle in where confrontation should have been. My father-in-law collapsed near the end of summer. The siren of the ambulance drew me to the window, heart pounding, and I saw Jong-hee slip a stuffed brown envelope under her arm as the family descended into chaos. I never imagined that envelope would become the wood for a fire that would nearly destroy all of us. He slipped away quietly a few days later, and amidst the rush of mourners paying their respects and relatives trading glances, a lawyer arrived. He opened the envelope to reveal a few crisp sheets. My father-in-law's will. The words on those pages were as solid and immovable as a stone wall. The hardware store property and savings were left entirely to Young-soo, the favored eldest. Everything else was to be managed by Jong-hee. For my husband, the youngest, and for me, there was nothing. Gripping the edge of the paper, I tried to steady my breathing. My hands found nothing to hold except that strange, heavy emptiness, while my heart filled with questions and quiet dread. From that moment, the air in the house thickened with suspicion and resentment. Guests whispered behind their sleeves, making slender speculations that piled up like spoons on a tray. I sat quietly in a corner, jotting dates and overheard snippets in a small notebook, my husband's shoulders slumping further each day. My mother-in-law wore an expression of unsympathetic certainty, insisting this was simply the natural order. Young-soo's wife spread tales of dutiful sacrifice, of having done all the bookwork for the hardware store, justifying the inheritance. My response as the youngest daughter-in-law was stoic silence. My own son, Min-soo, had already crossed the threshold into middle age. He'd divorced a year earlier and brought my only granddaughter, Daeon, to live with us. Daeon, quiet and gentle, tiptoed between the absence of her mother and the signatures on her father's divorce papers. My days revolved around measuring out her school supplies and budgeting her snacks like I balanced ledgers at the bank. Yet the words on the will felt as if they had no regard for the facts of our daily life, turning their frozen face away from the child I now cared for. That night, while the low chants of mourners echoed through the hall, my phone buzzed again. The number wasn't saved, the message frightfully brief. Just a set of numbers, a bank name, and the words for grandchild support. I reread that line until my mind stung, pretending I didn't understand. But each glance chilled me deeper. My rusty instincts as a bank clerk woke inside me. The arrangement of the digits, the context. That plain message had the power to shake the foundation of everything the will had declared. Something was being hidden, and not only from me. I tracked the number out of habit and found it led back to an old public phone down the street, near a half-abandoned strip of shops. That was strange enough. My curiosity drove me to a second-hand phone shop, where after some persistence, I discovered it had come from a cheap, unregistered phone that could have belonged to anyone. I stood amidst cracked phone displays and felt as if a ghost had nudged me, as if a disembodied hand had chosen this moment to deliver a message only I was meant to unravel. I became obsessed, unsettled, and meticulous. I began slipping away from the funeral home, returning to old banks where I'd once worked, politely greeting my successors and hoping none would ask why I was there. I never demanded anything illegal, but clung to the edges of the rules, using my well-trained intuition. In the dim light of the teller screens, familiar words jumped out to me amid the transactions in an account under the name Park Mi-jung, a stranger to me on paper. I observed that among routine entries like living expenses and retirement planning, there it was again. Grandchild support. The dates and numbers matched almost eerily with Daeon's milestones. Her medical bills, new shoes purchased after her mother left, extra art lessons paid for by someone who never explained. I flipped through my old notepads, cross-referencing expenses, stacking up the evidence. Whether for good or ill, someone in my family had been secretly transferring money for Daeon's care, hiding it behind another name. The secrecy hurt as much as it intrigued me. I felt an obligation to dig deeper, to bring everything out into the open, yet every discovery bound me tighter to confusion and anger. Arguments over the will began to heat up. Young-Soo's family treated our silence as consent. My mother-in-law's stare grew frosty, and my attempts to explain what I'd found to my husband were met with avoidance and cold indifference. Dawn, the child at the center of it all, quietly completed her homework in the next room, utterly unaware of the icy fissures running through our lives. At night, I stared at the kitchen wall, listening to the echo of my thoughts, searching for something, someone to blame, while my sense of who was right and who was wrong twisted ever further. One anxious day, I left the funeral home behind and followed the trail to an old neighborhood, searching for Park Mi-jung, the name on the secret bank account. The lane was narrow and cluttered, the kind of place people pass by without a second thought. I stopped before a battered mailbox and noticed a thick envelope from the very bank branch I had linked to the phantom account. My scalp tingled with dread. The evidence in my hands seemed to pulse, as if I could feel the secrets burning through the paper. Upon returning, I watched as my mother-in-law seemed to age overnight. I lay awake in bed, the feeling of the will's envelope against my fingertips, running over the texture of paper, the strange heaviness of the ink and stamps. For the first time, I allowed myself to name the unease brewing inside me. A suspicion that the will had been tampered with, that someone familiar but careless had tried to alter its meaning. I tried to anchor myself with memories of my father-in-law's kindness, the way he quietly slipped down extra rice cakes on Sundays or squeezed her hand after my son's divorce. Even so, the evidence continued to mount, refusing to allow for naivete. It was clear. Someone had used hidden money out of either loyalty or selfishness. Maybe both. My soul swung between loyalty, grief, and a growing, steely resolve. Then, the real clue came from the most ordinary of places. Sorting through Dawn's old box of schoolwork, I found an envelope stuffed with faded photos and crinkled receipts. There was my father-in-law and Dawn standing in front of a tiny bookshop together. On the back of the photo, his careful handwriting listed the date and a note for book money for his grandchild. The receipt matched, down to the day, the deposits I'd seen moving through the shadow account. Suddenly, everything slotted into place. While alive, he had stashed away money, quietly, using a friend's name, for the future of a granddaughter navigating the edges of our broken family. But something else nagged at me. The will's copy. The odd spacing of the official stamps. The ink ever so slightly lighter than it should be. My old habit as a bank clerk took over. I compared the original impression from City Hall with the document from the funeral and realized they differed. Someone had edited the document with an amateur touch. Someone who had access, but not the cool skill of a professional. That night, unable to sleep, I searched through drawers until I found an ancient USB stick my husband sometimes used. On my computer, I opened old scanned files, multiple versions of the will, slight differences in thickness and font, brushstrokes erased and rewritten. The file's last edited date matched the first night of the funeral. I stared at the timestamp, feeling a rush of cold sweat, the truth becoming undeniable. I clicked through one more file and found a short note typed in hesitant language, full of odd spelling mistakes. Special account for grandchild support, Park Mijong, monthly, part of retirement money, before inheritance finalized. My heart pounded. In that moment, I understood. The person who sent that cryptic message, the one who watched over the shadow account and who clumsily altered the will, was not some distant relative or ghostly outsider. It was my husband. Kisiok had scanned the will, erased and redrafted parts of it, and presented the altered copy to the family, all in a desperation I hadn't recognized. At the same time, he sent me the breadcrumb, trusting I would use my skills to follow the trail he'd left behind. The betrayal was sharp, landing not from a stranger, but from the person I'd trusted most. He had altered the will to protect what he believed was rightfully Dawn's, his granddaughter's future. Yet in doing so, he trampled the law, fractured our trust, and set the family against us, all beneath a facade of silent suffering. The next morning, I placed the will's copy, the evidence-laden USB, and my notebook in my bag, making for the law office with a heavy heart. I realized my place was not to fan the flames, but to find some way to quench them. Legal matters are never clean, especially where family is concerned. The lawyer explained that my husband's actions were, unmistakably, fraud, even if his intentions were rooted in love. Yet, the secret account represented a devotion to Dawn's future. When the time came, I advocated not to fight over every cent, but to establish a trust, 30% of the inheritance locked away for Dawn's support, with the rest divided according to the true original will. My husband's confession could not remain hidden, but I vowed to keep the focus on Dawn's well-being, not on punishment or blame. I accepted the responsibility, bearing the weight of generations of cold wars and silent struggles. Relations never completely healed. My mother-in-law never nodded in acceptance. Youngsu grew silent with a mixture of anger and shame. My husband and I have not returned to what we were. We share a house, but live in parallel, not touching eyes at breakfast or hands in the evening. But every month, I see the automatic payments for Dawn's tuition and insurance slip out of the trust account, and, just for a moment, I find a fragile sense of peace in the truth of those numbers. The wounds have shaped me in ways I didn't expect. We now occupy the same house, husband, wife, and granddaughter. Yet the distance between us looms larger than ever. At midnight, I still recall the single text that set this all in motion. It was only later that I realized both betrayal and love can wear the same face, that to protect a child, sometimes adults make terrible mistakes. Now, Jonghee closes up the shop alone, and Young-soo manages the hardware business, sending part of the profits into the trust. Ki-seok has returned to work with his hands, and I continue updating the household ledger every quarter, just as I always have. As the days settle into quieter rhythms, I find myself returning to that first message and its aftermath. I trace its lingering scars in the blank spaces of my accounting books, in the features and voices of everyone who survived the fire, my father-in-law's gentle eyes, my mother-in-law's stubborn chin, Young-soo's rigid posture, my husband's tired hands, and Dawn's determined smile. For the first time, I see the tangled family portrait for what it truly is. If you were in my shoes, how far would you be willing to forgive when a mistake is rooted in love's desperate attempt to protect someone precious?